Okay, I'm going to get started on the cab corners today. Cab corners aren't terrible, but pretty rusty on the outside, and also there's a panel on the inside too that's kind of rusted out, so I want to get started on that. They make these replacement cab corners, just both pieces. That's the outer cab corner there. It's a pretty big piece. Inner cab corner fits in like that. There'd be spot welds all along here and up in there. So I won't need the whole thing. This outer cab corner, you can see it's a pretty big piece. Covers a huge area. Goes all the way up to the bottom of the cab. But I don't need the whole thing. I basically just need this bottom corner. So I think I'm gonna just kind of cut off this bottom corner and use that, and the rest of this I won't need. I got to start on the passenger side here, and I only cut up as far as the rust went. So even though that cab corner, the new one, comes all the way up to somewhere up here, I don't need that whole thing. So I'm just going to replace this lower corner, and actually here it is. So this was the whole cab corner. I just cut off this bottom corner. That piece is going to fit just like that. So there are some tips and tricks to do this right. There's kind of right ways and wrong ways to do this. You could just slam it on there, put a bunch of welds across it, and mud over it. So the first thing is trying to get this to fit. And this piece, it was kind of sticking out here. Didn't fit exactly. These things never fit perfect the first time. So the first thing I had to do is trim this edge right here. And I just did that with one of these sandpaper wheels on the grinder. So just kind of had to work that in and out and bring this edge down till it fits nicely in there. So that's pretty good. If I line this bottom edge up, get that clamped in place first, then the next thing I want to line up is this top edge. And so this top edge, I don't know if you can see that, I cut this down and made a corner because I want this to be a butt weld. This can't overlap or there'll be an edge there and it can't really tuck underneath. So when I'm done, I want this blue line and this black line to match up. So I trimmed that so that it will fit right in that corner. And the rest of this lip here will kind of tuck up underneath a little bit. So the right way to do this really would be to cut this straight across and butt weld all along here. But with the welder that I have and with how thin a lot of the sheet metal is, when I try to do butt welds, a lot of times I just get burned right through. So it'll just make a big hole. So I'm going to do the flange weld method instead, where I make a little flange, tuck it up behind there, and then put a weld. And at least then I have a little bit of metal backing behind the cut line so that it doesn't burn through. So that's the method I'm going to use. And then I'll seam seal down in there into that seam to prevent water from collecting in there and creating rust. We could try tucking this flange underneath, kind of like that. And then vice grip this in place. So now we're getting closer, but got kind of a neat little tool here. So this is a flanging tool. It's an air tool. They make them kind of in vice grip format too if you just want to do it manually. But what this does is, let's say I've got a flat piece of metal like this. See how that's a perfectly flat edge? Let's say I want that to get welded up here. I can take the flanging tool, stick that in there, and now, I don't know if you can see that, but there's a little bit of a flange on there. So if I do that all the way across, now I've got a nice flange, and now I can tuck that up underneath there. And I got a line that's flush that I can weld. I could even pull that away a little bit make a gap, and now I can fill that gap with weld. And I just have that little flange behind there. So I can fill that gap with weld, and it's not going to burn through and make a big hole and make a big mess that I have to keep chasing with the welder. Another pretty cool thing that this flanging thing can do, on the back, it's got a little hole punch. So it can cut holes for spot welds. So one thing about welding sheet metal panels on cars is when you weld these, you do a technique called stitch welding, where you put a weld here and a weld here and a weld there. And these little spot welds, you don't want to weld too much in one spot at one time because they'll heat up the metal and make it warp. So you got to kind of move around a little bit. But the other thing is, at the end of the day, you have to fully complete your weld. All of your stitch welds, your spot welds, have to make a complete weld in the end. You can't just put a couple spot welds in all along and then mud over it and be done. Sometimes you see that from old repairs. Body shops used to do that back in the day. But the problem is, why you can't do that is if any moisture ever, if any moisture ever gets behind that from the back side of the panel, any water gets into that, it'll bubble your paint. So you want to make sure you have a continuous seam of weld all the way across with no pinholes, so that if this does get wet on the back side, that moisture can't seep through your pinholes or through your seam and bubble the paint. So once I grind this down, you'll see that it forms one continuous piece of metal that no moisture can get through. Okay, so on this weld I ground down on the back. I want to show you, if you look closely at the weld, I've got a couple pinholes right there and right there. So, you know, from a foot away it looks great, but looking real closely, maybe even right there too. So those are definitely potential spots where water could get behind that weld on the back side of that panel, come through and make a big bubble in your paint. So that's exactly what you don't want. So I'm gonna go back with the welder, put welds over the top of those two spots, and wherever that other one was, fill those in. Okay, so I went back with the welder and I just put a little spot weld over every single little spot where I could see that might potentially have a little pinhole. So now I'll grind those down. All right, this is what I want to see. Just a nice solid seam all the way across with no pinholes. All the way around the corner too. So this should require a little bit of filler, but not much at all if I did my job right. I didn't grind all the weld off completely. It got pretty smooth in the back, but since I flanged that piece of metal, I know that I've got some metal behind the weld. So there should be plenty of weld sitting in that channel between this piece of metal and that piece of metal where that flange was. There was kind of a little gully in there that's filled with weld. So even if this is pretty much ground smooth, I know I still have enough weld in there to hold the pieces of panel together. One more kind of neat thing. You see this outer cab corner where I welded? See where that weld line is? Right here. And where I'm going to put the inner cab corner in is down here. So the weld line on the top one is up here. So it's hidden behind this piece of metal. So if anybody ever climbs up underneath here and looks around, you can't see that weld seam for the outer cab corner at all. all you're going to see is a little weld seam down here for the inner cap, the inner corner. So that's another trick. I always try to hide the weld seams as much as I can when doing panels. Just try to make it look as factory as possible. Not that it matters, it's kind of nitpicky, but it's just a little more professional if you can hide your work as much as possible. So when people crawl around underneath it and look around, they don't see a bunch of seams and a bunch of ugly welds everywhere. It just kind of looks factory.